Well, welcome everyone back to Beaconsfield podcast. I'm really honored today to be speaking with Michael Posner and to be having a cultural conversation about Leonard Cohen, a figure who towers in my life, and I expect two Michaels. Michael is an award-winning writer, playwright, and journalist, and he's the author of 9 previous books. He's a Canadian, and this includes his last or 2 projects on Leonard Cohen, which are called the Untold Stories. It's a 3-part oral history of the man as a songwriter, as a lover, as a worshipper of God in all of his complexities. And these books are incredible for the extensive interviews that Michael conducted with people who knew Leonard or knew of him too. And they're an insight into the man's inner life, and in quite a way I've not seen elsewhere except through Leonard's songs themselves and his writings too. So Michael, thank you so much for being here and for having what I'm sure will be a very interesting conversation.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm really honored. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
We were just discussing before the interview started that you asked me how as a 23-year-old I came to Leonard Cohen, and I said that one of my earliest memories is hearing my mother playing live in London as a child around 3 or 4 in the car and not quite getting it. What's your story, Michael? One doesn't spend the 6 years that I expect you've spent with Leonard so far compiling an oral history, essentially living the lives of another man, unless there's something there important to them. What brought you to Leonard?
Well, I think I'm in my 6th year as we speak, but I'm going to be quite candid here. He came to my attention in the the mid 1960s as a poet, first of all, and a novelist. Although I wasn't terribly drawn to either the poetry or the novels. And so he really came to my attention as a singer-songwriter in the late 1960s or towards the late 1960s. And he came to the University of Manitoba to sing or to read and to sing at that time. He was sort of in transition mode from poet, novelist to singer-songwriter. And so I saw him then. Then the first album came out, and I remember playing that till it was worn out. More drawn, I think, to the melodies and the lyrics than to his voice per se. I don't think I ever really fell in love with his voice, but he was clearly writing lyrics that were at a higher level than almost anything you could hear anywhere else, and they were open to multifaceted, multi-levels of interpretation. He was truly a poet writing song lyrics, and that poetic instinct, that poetic talent and craft was so clearly embedded in the lyrics that it made for interesting just reading, just to sort of say, what's this guy getting at, or what are the possible meanings of these various phrases. Anyway, so I was interested in his work, but as the years went by, I would dip in and out. I liked certain songs and certain albums and liked others less. And then I had done another book on another Canadian writer named Mordecai Richler, who probably isn't terribly well known down under, but had had some success in Canada and in the United States. And then I actually saw Leonard one day on the street in Toronto. And I think that might have been the catalyst that I didn't approach him. I was too nervous, but I later wrote him and proposed to do a book on him, this kind of book that they ultimately ended up doing. And he turned me down in a very gracious way. And I put that project aside. Well, I had to. But when he died in 2016, it occurred to me to resurrect it, even without his participation. And so kind of blindly, haphazardly, I began just sort of making calls to people I knew who might have a Leonard Cohen story or two, and then it kind of snowballed from there, and one voice led to 2 more, and 2 more led to 6 more, and it just grew. And within a few months, I could see that I was assembling material that hadn't been heard before, and therefore might be of interest in book form. So I just kept pushing on.
Yeah, one of the great strengths of your books, I think, is that they they make no claim to one view of Leonard or to oneself. I think he used to say that part of the point of his poetry was to burn away all the selves that weren't truly him, to get to the true inner one, to kind of reach its self-knowledge. And in a way, your book echoes that. It's a kind of tragic chorus, if you like, of taking all these different voices and trying to understand what the different Cohens were that emerged. What was the process like, the very human process of literally interviewing, I think, over 500 people, to talking to them about Leonard? What was that like, those conversations themselves?
It was varied. I mean, in the early days, I decided I would spend money and go to see people personally, face to face. So that involved, frequent trips to Montreal and New York and Los Angeles, Europe on one occasion. Eventually, that that budget got stretched a little thin, and I began to do it by phone. And then when COVID intervened, I was kind of forced to go to Zoom and telephone. It was fascinating. I mean, some people, I said this before, some people had only met Leonard for 10 minutes, but they had a great Leonard Cohen story in their pocket. A story about Leonard, or somehow revelatory of Leonard's character. Others have knew him for 50 years and had many, many stories. And there's people in the book that I spent hundreds and sometimes thousands of emails exchanges with in basically follow-up interviews. And many others I spent many conversations with. So, I don't know how many thousands of hours of tapes. It was a laborious but fascinating process, to answer the question. You never really knew. Well, I often didn't know what I was going to come away with, and quite late in the process, I would find somebody would mention a name, and I'd say, why haven't I heard that name before? I've done 500 interviews. How can it be that there was an important person in his life that I haven't heard of? Not to be arrogant about it, because I don't want that. I'm not trying to project that, but I would be frequently surprised that, in another corner of Leonard Cohen's complicated, compartmentalized life, there was another person that he had a very strong relationship with, either platonic or romantic. And I would find that person and ask or beg for an interview. And sometimes I was rewarded, and sometimes it turned into a dead end. But it really was interesting how many people he connected with in such a meaningful way. So that was the process. It was just a lot of straight ahead, cold calling, emailing, track people down. Will you participate, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Have you got an example, Michael, of a story of someone who met Leonard for a very short amount of time and who had an impression about his character? Is there one that comes to mind? Because, I mean, the book's filled with them. There's small things, really, really small things. There was a guy when Leonard embarked on what really was his sort of first major European tour in 1972. His manager, Marty Machat, arranged for a film to be made. You probably know this, a film to be made of that expedition, Bird on a Wire, by British director Tony Palmer. And there's a whole long saga connected with the production and the subsequent post-production of that film. Leonard was showing it. He didn't like it. Tony Palmer very generously said, well, if you want to fix a few things, why don't you take a stab? I'll give it to you and you can hire an editor. And Leonard, it ended up becoming a runaway express train, and Leonard hired an editor, a friend of his, and it got completely reworked. And Leonard hated that one too. And it was finally showed, pardon me, that version was finally showed in London in July of 1974. And so this young man who is a Leonard Cohen fan went to that first screening in London. And he's
at a difficult stage. He's an adolescent. He's a troubled adolescent, or he has difficulties in his life. And Leonard speaks meaningfully to him, as he did to so many young men at that time, and women. And he approaches him in the press area, and just, thanks him and congratulates him, and says a few words about how meaningful, how very, very meaningful he found his work. And Leonard is very gracious and accommodating, as he typically was, frankly. I mean, this was not unusual. He was very approachable, and very sympathetic to people. And so they just exchange pleasantries, but it's a meaningful moment. And then there's nothing except that, I'm going to say 8 years later or 10 years later, or maybe fewer than that, the young man goes to a Leonard Cohen concert. And he goes backstage, or he waits backstage to meet him at the stage door when he comes out, and he approaches him and he says, I was at your screening, and he said, I want to apologize because I was the young fool who was at your screening. And Leonard says to him, well, I was the young fool who was in that film.
See, it's really interesting because, I mean, there are so many tensions at work in the book, but there's this kind of tension between Leonard being at the center of attention and being on the periphery at once. And that's not the exact phrase, but it's something like that. And what do you think? What is your take on the man's charisma, or his magnetism at least? What do you think were its sources, of which there were probably many? That ability to be at once, the center of the room and away from it too.
Yeah, as somebody says, he was the center of attention without ever trying to be the center of attention. Aviva Leighton, who was his friend for 50 or 60 years, just said he was magic. What was the core of it? There's something very, there's a stillness, a stillness and a silence at the heart of Leonard Cohen for all the words that he published. He had the ability to be very still, very in the moment. There's a story that an American writer, I forget his name at the moment, that Cohen knew a little bit in Greece. And he told me the story. You'll remember it when I tell you. They're sitting in a cafe in Athens. They've taken a day trip to Athens from Idra, and they're young men. They're in their 30s. They're both good-looking guys, and they're sitting in this cafe, and this guy notices that all these very attractive young women, Greek women, whatever, are suddenly approaching Leonard Cohen. And he said to me, I was a good-looking guy, but nobody was coming to me. And he said, it's what am I, chopped liver line? So he had that ability. He was just, it was a kind of, some of it was body language, a kind of posture. People talk about how many young singer-songwriters had an opportunity to meet him and play their music for him. And he would listen, and he'd be extremely still. He wouldn't give any sign of response, or he would never say, or very seldom would say, that's great. And he certainly never would say, don't like it or anything like that. But there's a story about a young man meets him in Switzerland in 1971, in the fall of 71. And he's a student at this kind of alternative university, and Cohen is there. His friend, the guy who edited the Bird on the Wire documentary, is making another documentary on Velikovsky, Emanuel Velikovsky, Worlds in Collision. And Cohen does a small cameo in that film and asks a question of Velikovsky. But they're hanging out at this university where Velikovsky is lecturing. And he meets this young man who is an aspiring singer-songwriter, and spends a few evenings with Cohen. And on one occasion has the temerity, or works up the courage to play him a song that he's written. And Cohen listens to it, and he has this kind of distant gaze. He gazes into the middle distance and seems to be absorbing it, but you're not really sure. And he says nothing. And the kid is a little bit chagrined, a little bit disappointed that he didn't get any kind of reaction. And then the next day in the elevator, he meets him in the hotel, and Cohen sings the song back to him, or a portion of the song. And he's blown away because he played it once. The guy knew the melody, knew the lyrics. He had clearly been listening very intently. So it's a combination of stillness and body language and concentration and focus. It's a kind of reverse psychology, in order to gain attention, try not to gain it. And
there's someone in the book who says, I think somewhere, that the source of his attraction, charisma, whatever you want to call it, magnetism, was that people would come to him rather than he to them. And
he knew that, he was the flame that the moths came to.
Yes. Which raises the question, Michael, some people in the book claim that Leonard was a great performer. I mean, that was a kind of cultivated persona and performance that he thought very carefully about projecting. And, I've always found it interesting to go and read Leonard's earlier poetry and the earlier novels, particularly The Favorite Game, and then to consider the persona that emerges of him in that art and that work as compared to the later stuff, when he becomes the kind of humble old man. Even Cohen would have been around my age now when he was writing that stuff. And there is a kind of self-consciousness about it. There is even at times a haughtiness, an awareness of his own brilliance. And, one could really believe, coming away from reading what I love, those earlier works, that he was cultivating very carefully this persona of the kind of duende-drenched, dark poet in the corner. To what extent do you think that stuck with him? If I'm right in that perception, was he cultivating this persona, or was it really him? It's probably both.
Well, I think he did cultivate that persona. I think I would agree with everything you said. There was a certain arrogance and haughtiness to that early Leonard Cohen, and I think he was acutely conscious of it. Some of it was clearly pure persona. Some of it was imbibed in the atmosphere of living with Irving Layton for so long. Layton was another Canadian poet who was full of braggadocio, I don't know how to pronounce it, and who lived a larger than life, who trumpeted his own brilliance on every possible occasion, and who believed that experience was everything, and you should take every opportunity to experiment and live large and not be modest, not be falsely modest about your talents. And he was a huge proponent and fan of Leonard Cohen's work, needless to say. And I think Layton's influence is certainly apparent in those earlier years. I think Cohen grows very uncomfortable with that arrogance. He sees it in himself, and he doesn't like it. And I think he works hard to diminish it. I mean, he has one great famous song, the Stranger's song. The singer must die for the lie in his voice. He's on the road singing these songs night after night, and the mere act of having to do that night after night in a different city before a different audience, for him cheapens the experience. It diminishes and somehow trivializes the serious intent of the song, because it's just repetitious and becomes monotonous. And that song comes out of that experience, I believe, where he's trying to be an authentic writer. He's trying to convey an authentic message, and somehow the experience of being on the road, of being in show business writ large, is in contradiction to that. But you're right. There is that haughtiness. I think it ultimately gives way, and he becomes this extraordinarily humble guy that people on meeting him think he must be putting them on, because he's so humble. He's so self-effacing, as to make himself invisible, that they think they think it's a con. Um,
There's that wonderful line.
he meets. I'll just take one more second. He
No,
meets
please.
the great writer Pico Iyer in the mid
Yeah.
'90s, who comes to visit him, and Pico is a seasoned, not cynical, but a seasoned journalist who's been exposed to a lot of con men in his day, and his initial thought is that he's playing me here. He's playing me. This guy's in robes. He says, "Can I, what can I make you to eat? Let me carry your bags." But he says, you spend a week there, and the guy's shoveling snow at 3 a.m. and getting up to sit cross-legged for 6 hours at a time, and punishing himself in physical and mental ways. That can't be a con. It just can't be.
Yes.
And so he comes to see the legitimacy, the honesty, the authenticity of the man.
Yes, and this question of religion and God and discipline and how they all interweave in Cohen's life is also a really important one. One already knew this before, would know this before jumping into your book, but your book brings it home in a way I've never seen before. I mean, the extent to which Leonard was really seeking different ways to God and women. For him, the two, I guess, were one, love and God. What was Leonard's relationship to God, do you think, Michael, particularly towards the end of his life? And how did he relate to the various religious traditions, Zen, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, Hinduism? Like, what was he searching for?
We don't have time to explore to find an answer to that question. It's the central question, however. Yeah. God is very much the center of his search. I mean, women are, to some extent, they are muses, and there's a certain spirituality that it comes with a romantic relationship to a woman, but it's God that the real dialogue is with God, and it's a dialogue that stretches from the Book of Mercy, which the book of Mercy, which is full of basically psalms that are psalms of praise, mainly to God. But at the same time, on many occasions, he's completely full of doubt. On other occasions, he's completely angry. I mean, by the end, there's a clear anger at God. There's many references to the Holocaust and God's absence during the Holocaust. And just to what Leonard frequently called this Vale of Tears, the kind of quotidian suffering that humanity is susceptible to, and God created the world and then withdrew, and there's a very Kabbalistic concept in that that he was an avid student of, but he's very much searching for. I think he's very much searching for the meaning of life. I mean, it's a cliche, but I think that's what his search was all about. So yes, Christianity not in the Pauline sense. It's a pre-Pauline Christianity. It's Jesus who's still Jewish. It's Jesus as this great man. I think at one point he called Jesus the greatest man who ever lived.
Yeah, that's the Leonard's, coolest guy.
Yeah, coolest guy, or the greatest man, and the Sermon on the Mount is the greatest piece of literature ever written. So he was authentically interested in Christianity, but not in the sense of Catholic rituals or transubstantiation or any of those things. Zen was a very serious pursuit, but it had, I think, ultimately less to do with Zen and the principles of Zen than it had to do with the master, the guru who led the monastery on Mount Baldy, Joshu Sasaki Roshi, who he meets in approximately 1971 and is with more or less for the next 45 years, 40 almost 45 years, even though he goes off in the late 1990s and early 2000s to India. Between 1999 and 2003 or 4, he goes 6 times to India to study Advaita Hinduism. 6 times.
Wow.
And becomes a serious student of Ramesh Balsekar in Mumbai. And we haven't mentioned Scientology,
Yeah.
which he dabbled in and never said anything bad about. He left Scientology, but not because he disowned its principles or its teachings or its methodologies. I think he said that he said positive things about it. I think what he perceived was that they wanted to take advantage of his persona at the time, and he was very much opposed to that. So he left. And before that, there was the I Ching, and before that, he delved into Sufism. So so you're absolutely right when you say this guy was a searcher. But you know what I've neglected to talk about here is his Jewish search, which is the Kabbalah, and deeply invested. Even in the 1970s, when he's still exploring Zen Buddhism, he's putting on talis and tefillin. He's studying with a Chabad rabbi in Montreal. He's reading texts. He's a serious. He's an Idra, and he asks a friend to send him Gershon Sholom's biography of Sabbatai Tzvi, the so-called false messiah of the Jews. He's deeply invested in this stuff. Later in Los Angeles, he meets a convert rabbi who is a brilliant student of Kabbalah, and starts to study with him. And then he meets another guy online who's an even more esoteric Kabbalist, and he becomes a student of his and a patron of his as well. So he has all of these things going on for him, and of course he brings them into his art. You can go through the lyrics and the poems, and you can see, or you can try to see exactly what he's alluding to in these various religions, because he's learned from them all.
It's very interesting, because I've often thought about Leonard as a kind of poet of defeat, or philosopher of defeat. Part of his of the outlook that I think emerges is this notion that we are in the world after the fall, to use his phrase, and that you just can't. What did he say? You can't. Nothing works in this human realm. This doesn't admit of perfect solutions or resolutions. But you've still just got to say hallelujah anyway. It's about saying before, or standing witness before the brokenness and saying this is still worth loving. There's still a nobility here that can be found, and perhaps that's what he's searching for in each of those traditions. Would you say that is what he comes to?
I absolutely would. Defeat is the default position. That's where we begin, and you've got to work hard to try and rise above that defeat, and it isn't easy, and many people fail. So some of those songs are I think attempts to try to, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. There is some degree of hope. Others of them are pretty bleak, I'm afraid, especially, you want it darker, put out the flame, you kill the flame. These are very dark poems. And so, I think you said it earlier on. I think if my books have done anything or do anything, I hope that they will see that you can't pigeonhole a guy like Leonard Cohen. He's not reducible. He's not binary. He's too complicated for that. And he's not a perfect human being. There are stories in the books about women who were badly treated, and they're rare. And even those who were badly treated, astonishingly enough, in some cases, refused to say anything bad about him. Because he was such a meaningful presence in their life for the time that he was in their life. But he is hugely complicated and irreducible.
I really wanted to talk about this because the great shadows of this book are some of those stories with women, particularly, the very intense, tragic, beautiful relationship with Gabriela Valenzuela that you reveal, which influenced much of Cohen's writing around Hallelujah and Take This Waltz, which I think she translated, which is pretty extraordinary. How do we Were you confronted by those shadows when you heard about them? These sorts of stories, you know, where you hear of Leonard's kind of incredible inability to commit, but also sometimes to be cold, misunderstand boundaries, and to, you know, not have the kind of classical empathy and generosity that he was normally known for. How did you respond to those stories?
Yeah, the violations of etiquette are pretty rare. I mean, the treatment
Yeah,
of Gabriella is somewhat tragic, and it's a bit ambiguous.
yeah,
You know, just to for your listeners' sake, what happens is that he meets her in 1980, begins a relationship with her about 2 years later, and that relationship extends from 1982 to mid 1986. She becomes pregnant, and when she does, she is unable to find him. He's traveling or unavailable, and she is forced to undergo an abortion without ever being able to tell him or confide in him or receive some kind of emotional nurturing support from him,
mm,
and never finds the emotional closure to that relationship that was for her quite intense, and I think for him quite intense. Um, a question mark hangs over it, which is simply, did he actually know that she was pregnant, and was so fearful of the whole idea of being involved in pregnancy, abortion, possible fatherhood, that
mm,
he just kept his distance deliberately until it was resolved without his participation, or was he not? Was he completely ignorant of it? Um, so that there's some ambiguity on that issue. But by and large, as I said earlier, and there were other women who were hurt, but but their experience with Leonard was so meaningful to them. They felt so special in his world, in his presence, that even if they knew he was, when he left them, he was off with some other women, they somehow came to terms with this,
mm,
and coped with it.
mm,
Um, uh, he doesn't behave crudely. There's by and large. I mean, there are a couple of occasions where he seems to cross the line, but generally speaking, he's very courteous. He's very gracious. He's seductive, but he's not using. He's not Harvey Weinstein. He's not Roman
mm,
Polanski.
mm,
There's nothing coercive about
mm,
his seduction.
mm, mm.
It's a very slow burn, and a very seductive come on, and they needless to say, responded in the main very favorably to that.
Yeah, there's there's a documentary with Adrienne Clarkson when they're going through compiling. I can't remember which book it is. I don't know if it's the Book of Longing or something before that. Um, and she asks him. She says, you know, you talk so much about love and the fact that you need a tight connection in your life, but for much of your life you've been alone, as long as I've almost known you. And you know, and he says something like, she says to him, you know, would you like to have people around you? You seems like you don't need them all the time. And he says, oh, maybe some, you know, it'd be nice to have them around some of the time. Do you think that Leonard was lonely?
Yeah, I do think he was lonely, and I think he knew that he was lonely. Um, he I think he knew that his real commitment was to his work and his art,
Mm,
um, and God comes into that equation as well, because the work is so much of the work is aimed at exploring the God questions. Um, but he loved the company and attention of women, and he craved it. There are some some interesting women that he meets in volume 3 who have some interesting things to say, and that interview with Adrienne is a part of it. Actually, there's an interesting little moment in that film,
mm,
where he talks about, I think he's talking about translating the Lorca poem that became Take This Waltz. And he says, oh, I could show you the notebooks that are the the paper pads, the lined paper pads, and he goes and he gets one, and he starts to flip through it, and if you would only know this if you knew about Gabriela Valenzuela, but they had each drawn each other in these sessions, these translation sessions that they held in the mid 1980s, and you can see her drawing of his and his drawing of her. She's actually her little pencil drawing of him and his of her is actually in that film, but she's unnamed. She's unnamed. Yeah, I think somebody I think Eric Lerner, who was a friend of his for 40 years and wrote a wonderful memoir called Matters of Vital Importance, which was his own inside joke, I think. But he describes he describes having dinner with Leonard, and Leonard sort of saying, something like, it's a great life, but it's I don't think he uses this word, but something like it's a bitch to dine alone. He does need women, but he certainly needs his privacy. Look, when he takes up again in the early 2000s with the singer Anjani Thomas, who is also a collaborator, a wonderful singer, he immediately buys her own home. They don't live together. He needs his space. And certainly by that time he certainly felt he needed his space. So yeah, I think there is a profound loneliness there, but one that he came to terms with, because it was the work that mattered most.
Yeah, I came across another letter. It was online or something like that, but a young person had written to Leonard for advice on life. And he says, find a trade. Be employed. Unemployment is the great affliction of man. And he really means that, doesn't he, in a full sense, that is the consistent thing throughout his life. It is the work. What did you make of the man's work ethic? Because it seems incredibly intense to me.
Yeah, I think it was. I interviewed Kelly Lynch, his personal manager, the woman who was accused and not convicted. She was not convicted. She was accused of stealing and spending $5 million of his money. She claims that Leonard's work ethic was not all it was cracked up to be, that he wasted many hours shopping and watching television and eating and whatever. My own theory is that he worked very, very hard. Look, you can see it in the lyrics. I mean, the 80 verses of Hallelujah that were apparently written, and Democracy had 50 verses, and many of these things he would write them over and over and over again and prune one word or add or delete a comma, or he worked hard. And there is, I don't know this for a fact, but I suspect that there's a lot of work in the archive that is unseen. Many, many songs, lyrics for sure, and some melodies. I suspect there's probably a novel somewhere in there as well that hasn't come to light. He worked hard. I'm sure he slowed down as the years passed, but he worked very, very hard.
Yeah, I mean, he never really lost that. I mean, he was a writer, wasn't he? So he comes from that Montreal school, the serious.
Yeah, the other interesting thing is that he doesn't like to repeat himself. If you go through his work, you see that he's willing to try different things. The leap from Energy of Slaves in 1972 to Death of a Ladies' Man, the book, the poetry volume, is huge. It's a complete change of form. And then to Book of Mercy, here's a guy who's a bit of a rock star by 1984, and he's putting out an album, Various Positions, which is it became controversial, as you know, because the record company failed to see the merit in it and refused to release it in United States initially.
And that's got Hallelujah on it, doesn't it?
It's got Hallelujah. It's got Dance Me to the End of Love. It's got If It Be Thy Will, If It Be Your Will.
Wow.
Yeah, it's got three of his greatest songs. And Walter Yetnikoff, the president of CBS Records, says, "I'm into tonnage, Leonard. I'm into tonnage. I don't think it's going to sell."
Oh man.
And anyway, but at the simultaneously, he's writing this quite different little book of mercy, a very personal, reflective, basically a search for God, or a dialogue with God, a kind of dialogue with God, and it with strong Judaic echoes of the book of David's Psalms and of other Jewish works that he had studied. So he would experiment, and then of course when Yetnikoff says to him, "Well, I want you to be more commercial," essentially says, Leonard goes out and starts writing "I'm Your Man" and then the Future album, both of which were probably his most commercially successful albums. And so he asked for a change of pace, and he delivered the change of pace.
Right.
And then it's, I don't know how many years between the Future album and Dear Heather, but that's a complete change of pace. No, it's not. It's 10 New Songs with Sharon Robinson. So he didn't want to be comfortable. He didn't want to repeat himself, and I think he tried hard not to anyway.
I must ask you, because I love asking every Leonard Cohen fan, what do you think of Death of a Ladies' Man, the album? Do you think it was the failure that Leonard thought it was?
There's a few tracks that I think are completely over the top with that Spectre production,
Wall of Sound
thing. But some of the melodies I think are pretty good. I think Memories, which is a song that Leonard would sing on occasion, is you could come right out of the 1950s or early 60s and without any trouble. And that's my vintage. I mean, that's when I was an adolescent that long ago. And I love that music and I love that song.
Me too.
The lyrics are pretty good. On all of them, frankly. Don't Go Home With Your Heart On is obviously a bit of a joke, but some of the songs are pretty good. I think he was embarrassed by it. The whole experience was largely negative for him. Largely negative.
Yeah. I wonder, Michael, as a final point, is there a particular song that sticks with you that you think cuts through to your version of Leonard, the one that resonates most with you? I mean, I say your version because there are so many Leonards.
There's so many. I mean, if you look at If It Be Your Will, which I think is one of his greatest songs. He's writing like Samuel Beckett would write song lyrics. I mean, it's just so sparse. It's so pared down to its essence. There's a song he wrote on 10 New Songs with Sharon called Boogie Street. It's her tune, her melody. Do you know? And
I do. Yeah.
It's very located in time because it's about the experience. It's at once very specific to the time because he's decided to leave Mount Baldy. He spent 4 years as an inji or assistant to Sasaki Roshi, ironing his robes and making his travel plans and traveling with him, cooking,
drinking with him,
drinking every night with him. And becoming a bit of a slave to him, frankly, and so much so that he begins to see that this is, for him, not sustainable. And that's part of his decision-making to go to India in 99, is to get away from Sasaki Roshi. But so he's leaving Mount Baldy. He's leaving, for the moment at least, Rinzai-ji, Zen Buddhism, and he's going to re-immerse himself in the world. And Boogie Street is a song about that re-immersion. But if you follow the lyrics, it kind of ends with a kind of "What's it all about, Alfie?" question mark, which is what are we all doing here? Like,
Mm.
what is this journey about? And later he's often asked about the lyrics of the song, and he says, even Mount Baldy is Boogie Street in a sense. It's all Boogie Street.
Mm.
Although he kind of says that after the fact, but I think it's one of his great songs, and not as widely known. But there's so many. Your questions are mostly fair, but that's not a fair question.
And yeah, no, as a this is truly the final question, but that it just came to mind. You're writing the third volume now, which will be, Leonard's last years. Do you think that he still saw the world as a Vale of Tears towards the end? Because
absolutely.
He did. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Because what was your qualifier?
Well, just that line that he always quotes from Ben Jonson that I love, which he says, "I've studied all the philosophies and religions, but cheerfulness kept breaking through." The joy in his life too. But you think he did. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's the cheerfulness is another version of that's how the light gets in. It's not unredeemably black, but as you said right at the beginning, or in the middle of the conversation, defeat is the principal overarching theme of the world that we have inherited, or the world that was created for us. And struggle is our daily bread. But he, and this just to add one little point here, which is how infectiously funny the man was, how witty and how quick in a dry way. Like he wasn't Jackie Mason, he wasn't Henny Youngman, he wasn't telling jokes, but he could offer an acerbic barb, like nobody else in a second, and distill the essence of a moment into that joke, and take the sting out of whatever the hurt was. He was fully conscious of how black things were, but he had that, I don't know if it's a Jewish sensibility, but he certainly had the sensibility to see the humor in it, and to identify that humor, and to crystallize it, which is quite a gift.
And to make of defeat an experience, and even though it all went wrong, I'll stand before the Lord of Song with nothing on my tongue but hallelujah. I mean, what a wonderful way to throw one's hands up to the tragedies of life.
And to write a song that is the most covered song, I think, in the history of modern music.
Absolutely. Yeah. But Michael, thank you so much for this conversation. I've really enjoyed this, and it's been such when's the next book come out, by the way, so we can all know what are the.
I think the pub date is early October in North America, maybe a little bit later in Australia and Europe. Cool. It's Untold Stories. That's how the light gets in. Actually, I borrowed that phrase.
Yeah, well, great. Well, I'll be looking forward to that immensely, and I'm sure the listeners will too.
Thank you so much for doing this. I'm very grateful.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.